Lance was 39 years old when I quit my job to stay at home as his full-time caregiver. Neuropsych testing at that time revealed moderate cognitive impairment in some areas. Within a few years, all tests revealed moderate to severe cognitive impairment in all areas. Dementia was what they called it. One time during those early days of his dementia, we were in his primary care doctor's office for a regularly scheduled appointment. And Lance kept answering the doctor's questions, and they were not right. And I kept correcting him. And he needed to use the restroom. So he went down the hall, and his doctor turned and looked at me and said, "You can't do that to him." And that made me stop and think about how I was responding to Lance's dementia. And I realized that no matter how many glimpses of the old Lance I saw, he was never coming back. Just that simple statement from his doctor opened my eyes to how I was responding to him, and it helped me move forward in a more positive way, and it helped us live a more peaceful life. When you're communicating with someone who has dementia, it's vital that you understand that you are living in their world. You're living in their reality. And no matter how hard you try or how much you wish for things to be different, it doesn't change the reality of the situation.
Those are heavy words. This topic for conversation, as you know, was brought to my attention, and I'm sure you had thought of it and had planned to eventually cover this topic or address it. But it was brought to my attention by a sweet coworker who is caring for parents and who is dealing with watching a parent navigate dementia and cognitive decline. And I talk to a lot of people. I'm a chatty person, and so I chat with anyone that wants to talk. And over the course of my life, I've encountered plenty of people who have cared for loved ones with dementia. And I see the same look in all their faces. It's the same look that you have in your face, and it is heartbreak. I see it over and over again, whether they're currently dealing with it, whether they've dealt with it in the past, or whether they're just starting to deal with it. I see absolute and utter heartbreak. And when you first mentioned to me about realizing that the Lance you knew was never coming back, it made me think about the way we accept whatever our current situation or circumstance is. And I thought about when you're dealing with a loved one or caring for a loved one who has dementia, there's not just the acceptance of the fact that they are in that current state, but there must be a separate acceptance of the loss of who they were. Now, I don't know if those two are so tied together that they become one thing, or if they're two completely separate processes. So I wanted to ask you, like, accepting the fact that you would not see who you knew your husband to be ever again, was it the same process as accepting that you now have a cognitively impaired husband?
For me, it was two different processes. Grieving the loss of the old Lance and realizing that I was never going to see him again, that was something that I could process and let go. I mean, it's not something that ever completely went away, but it was something that I could mostly let go of. It wasn't something that I thought of all the time. It wasn't something that I grieved constantly. But his cognitive impairment was our new reality that was ever changing. So I continued to grieve that loss all the rest of the years that he was alive because it was a gradual decline. And so I was continuing to lose pieces of him over and over and over again. So it might seem like it's the same thing, but there were two very distinct differences in it.
Interesting. That's never been exactly clear to me how you walk through that process. It seems oftentimes with a loss, period, you grieve the loss, but with a new reality, the acceptance of the new reality, it's not necessarily a grief process. It's a coming to terms with, well, perhaps it is a grieving process because you had a dream of how your life was going to be. And so now you have a death to that dream. And that is a separate thing from the loss of what was. It's now the loss of what might have been. And that's not exactly an easy thing to reconcile. I went through that with when I went through my divorce, I realized that they were two completely separate losses, the loss of my marriage and the loss of my future, or how I had perceived my future to be. And so I didn't know where I was. I didn't know which way was up. So I can't even imagine walking through that in a constantly evolving way. I think that's good for people that are maybe supporting a caregiver dealing with dementia, to realize that their life is constantly evolving, just as their loved one's life is constantly evolving.
Well, it's constantly changing, but it's a constant decline. And this is something, it is a loss. It's a constant grieving of the losses. So, and I don't know any other situation that I can really compare it to, because for us, it was 12 years that we knew that there was something wrong with him cognitively, and to watch him decline a little bit at a time, and then plateau, and then decline some more, and then plateau, and then decline some more. And then at the end, there were no more plateaus, and just watching him continue to decline, it was just loss after loss after loss after loss. And that's something that is really hard to explain. You did a good job of that with talking about the loss of the life that you had thought you were going to have. Um, and I think that it's the same thing when you're dealing with the dementia. It's just that, okay, this is our new reality, and it lasts for a year. And then there's more decline. And then you've got a new reality. So you go on this journey of, this is the way that it's going to be. And then it changes, and you grieve the loss of the last decline because it wasn't as bad.
Right. I can't imagine how that would impact your own mental stability. And I imagine you question yourself. Was it as bad as I thought it was? Was it as good as I thought it was? Because your perception is the baseline now. It's not, it's no longer two people having a conversation about what was. It's now just your memory. You're the only reference point. And that's a heavy burden to carry.
Right. And it's harder when you live with people around you who are in denial of what is happening.
So based on what we've been talking about, what kind of practical advice would you give someone who is caring for a loved one, that would help them bring peace and comfort to the person dealing with the dementia?
I would say number one, you need to realize that you are living in their world. I know that I've already said that, but their reality is different than your reality. There's something going on in their brain that you can't change. So you need to enter their world. You need to become a part of their world. It's also going to depend on what stage of dementia they're at. And there are so many resources out there for dementia now. There weren't that many resources when I first started dealing with this, but there are a lot of things that you can look for. You can do searches on the internet for dementia. But what I did was I just met Lance where he was at. I was living in his world. I was living in his reality, and I knew him so well. I think that is another very important aspect of this, is that it's very important to get to know the person that has the dementia so that you know what their likes and their dislikes are, and you can bring things like that to their attention when you find that they're getting agitated or whatever it is.
I think that's a very important point to make, that knowing someone well is it's a really integral piece to being able to care for them well, and in a way that's respectful, in a way that is comforting, and in a way that is peaceful. Um, I I can't imagine being lost in my own mind, so I would imagine that helping someone to navigate that in a peaceful way and bringing comfort to them has to be a relief for someone dealing with dementia.
Yeah.
Um,
I
just some peace.
it was it fascinated me. It made me so sad watching Lance decline, but it also fascinated me to think what is going on in his brain that is turning him into this person that I don't know. And I just did as much research as I could. And whenever I saw that there was a problem, I did what I could to fix it to make him more comfortable. And there are a couple of things that I can think of specifically. There is a problem with people who have dementia and eating their meals. There's something about them being able to see their food on the dishes that they are presented on. And I had just purchased white plates before he got the diagnosis of dementia. And he was having a much harder time eating his food. I noticed that he wasn't enjoying his meals. I noticed that he wasn't eating as much. And that was very out of character for him. He loved food and he would eat everything on his plate. It didn't matter what I put in front of him, he would eat it. And so I started doing a little bit of research and I ended up buying Fiesta ware, all the multicolored dishes, and I would color coordinate them with the meals so that his food would stand out on them. And I started noticing that he would remember what he had for breakfast because he would remember what color bowl it was in. And then when I was making a meal and he'd ask what was for dinner, I would tell him and he'd say, "Can you put it on this color plate?" So it became something that he actually remembered, which was so strange, but it was such a significant thing. And I'm so glad that I did that. I probably did that about, wow, maybe 8 years before he passed away. I don't even know how long it was, but, and it might not have been that long, but it surprised me how much he remembered just because of the color of the plates. And then there was another time that he was becoming very anxious and he seemed scared often. And I noticed that when I would take him, okay, and let me just explain a little bit of that. He was, um, I could tell that there were some more changes happening in his brain and he was starting to forget more things and he was becoming fearful. But when I would take him to the hospital, which the VA hospital, that's where all the clinics were and everything, and I noticed a change in him whenever someone with scrubs would start talking to him, start telling him what he needed to do, giving him directions, whatever it was, that just gave him a sense of calm and peace. And so I bought some scrubs and I wore scrubs for probably about a year to a year and a half because the scrubs, even though I was his wife, he was at some times having trouble remembering who I was or looking up at me and saying, "You look familiar, but I can't remember your name." That was hard. That was really hard. But I realized that that was a part of his fear too. So I bought those scrubs. And if he didn't remember who I was, if he didn't recognize me right away, the scrubs gave him comfort and gave him a sense of calm and peace. And that just made it so much easier for both of us.
That's wow. Wow, that's crazy. Um, Such simple things, but brought such a sense of comfort and safety to him. Um, I can remember one of the best experiences that I had with you and Lance was a time that involved music that was super memorable to him, and watching his face light up when he heard familiar and loved, you know, music. It was indescribable, the change in his face. What what role do those tangible or highly memorable or very specific things play in caring for a loved one with dementia? We've talked in previous episodes about pictures on the wall. I had the experience with music. You talked about scrubs. Like, what role do you think those things play in helping you to care for him?
Oh my gosh, it was huge. That was, I don't know that there was anything more important than doing that because that all it's all rolled into I'm living in his world. And that's what I did. Our life was his world. And whatever he needed that to be, that's what it was. And I remember the music too. I remember one time when you came over, and I think this might be the time that you're talking about. Was it Alan Jackson?
Yes.
Alan Jackson was a big one for us. We saw him in concert twice. We loved him so much. And I had that playing one day. And I know that you were always on a schedule when you came over, and he just wanted to keep listening to it. So we left it on while he worked out because it just, oh, it did. It made such a difference to him. And I journaled about this a lot too while he was on hospice. Music made him come alive like nothing else did. And it didn't matter what the music was, any music would make him pause. And I could see an instant change in him. But music that was familiar to him was, I'm not sure that I even have any videos of that, but I remember when we would watch old movies from the 80s too, because we were both teenagers in the 80s, and he loved the music from them. Footloose was a big one. He requested that. I want to say we watched Footloose every day for months when he was on hospice because he couldn't remember that he had watched it, let alone that he'd watched it 40 times. But the music was what he really loved about it. And it also depends. That's another thing that depends on what stage of dementia they're in. I know that even early on with Lance, having photographs of us from before he got really sick, before he was disabled, those were upsetting to him. I had had a practice of every year on our anniversary, we would get out our photo albums and we would look back through them to remember the life that we had lived and to show our gratitude for all that we had been through and that we were still together. And at some point, that became very upsetting to both of us. It was upsetting to me because I recognized all the losses. I remembered all those things. I knew all the losses that we had suffered. It was upsetting to him because he couldn't remember. So that was when I started putting up more pictures of places that we had been so that we could talk about them. And even if he didn't remember it, he would know that we had been there. And it wasn't upsetting to him to see pictures of us when he was not as sick. Probably the last 5 or 6 years, I could have pictures of us from that period of time. But before that, I couldn't put up any pictures of us.
Do you think it was just upsetting to him? Do you think because he would catch little glimpses of his memory, and so that was upsetting to him, either that he couldn't fully place it or that it was not, that it no longer existed? Do you think that was it, or was it just confusion as to who it was?
Um, I don't think that he was confused about who it was. There were times that he told me. I always wanted to know what was going on in his mind. So I would sit down and listen to him when there was something upsetting him, and I would try to draw out what it was. And there was one time that he talked about his memory, and I wanted to understand. And so I was asking him questions, and he said it felt like there was something that should be there that was missing, and he just didn't know how to find it. And so I think that that's probably what it was all those years, because he always knew that it was him in the photos. But, and I don't know, beyond that, I don't know what else it was.
Hmm. Interesting.
I think the most important thing in all of this when you're dealing with someone who has dementia is that you need to really know who they are. You need to know what their likes and dislikes are, and avoid the things that you know will set them off or that will upset them. We've talked about some of the funny things that Lance did when he, when you met him. He'd been doing this for years, but so we've talked about some of the funny things that Lance would do when he had dementia. And one of them that absolutely drove me crazy, and it still irritates me when I think about it today, was he always wanted to get rid of my things. We had so much stuff, and there was a period of time when we were first married, we were very minimalist. We didn't keep things, went through the house every 6 months, and we got rid of things that we didn't need. And we just tried to keep the clutter to a minimum. And then the last 15 years of his life, he was so sick, and we never went through anything again. And we hardly ever got rid of things. And so there was clutter all over the house, and it drove both of us crazy. But his solution to that was to just get rid of my things. He always wanted to have a garage sale, and he'd start pulling things out. I don't use this. I don't use this. I don't use this. And I would always say, no, Lance, those are my things. You cannot get rid of my things.
I have fond memories of working with him, a training session in your office, and he'd be on that stationary bike, and he'd look up at the shelves of movies, and he'd always pull his headphones off because he'd have his headphones on watching the movie to keep him focused. But it wasn't enough. He'd look at the movies, take off his headphones, and say, I've been thinking we should probably have a yard sale and get rid of some of those movies. And we've got a lot of stuff around here we just don't use. And I would hear you in the other room, Lance, quit trying to get rid of my stuff. And
every
every
time.
every time we had to talk about the yard sale for the movies that you don't watch anymore.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And part of me would always one of the reasons that that is so funny to me is that Lance always before his dementia, he always liked to get a rise out of people. So he would do things like that just to irritate me. And so even though he wasn't trying to irritate me then, it was the same reaction because it was something that he would have done to me before the dementia.
Well, and I can also remember because he was pretty advanced by the time I met him. His dementia had advanced quite a bit, and he'd be riding a stationary bike and he'd be telling me a story and I would be listening to the story, and I can remember looking at you in the background going, indicating that that never happened.
I did that with everybody. I know that people, that's probably one of the memories that I hear from people the most. I remember that time when he was telling me this story. You're standing behind him, shaking your head, putting my hand across my neck like that never happened. That never happened. Because he was such a great storyteller. It was hard to tell if he was if he knew what he was talking about, if he was being serious or what. So I always wanted to make sure that people knew that this was because of his dementia.
So I have a question about that. When he was doing his personal training sessions, he would frequently tell me the story about running cross country when he was young. And I don't know that I've ever asked you this. Did he talk about that a lot anyway, or was being physically active kind of a trigger for that memory and something that would come to the forefront of his mind?
That that was something that triggered him. I think being active reminded him of those times in his youth because he was an athlete. So there were times that he would say something and it was accurate, but a lot of times those stories would be combined from something that happened in his youth and something that happened yesterday.
Well, he was an excellent storyteller. Oh, for sure.
He was believable, wasn't he? Even with the dementia.
Always.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was challenging for me. One of the things that he did, and he did this for years, he had that surgery on his skull and it left a big S-shaped scar on the back of his head. And he kept his hair really short. He always had since I met him. And when he would get it cut first thing for about 2 weeks, you could really see that scar. And he would tell people, well, he had that surgery 20 years before he passed away. And so 8 to 10 years before the dementia really set in, he was already telling this story that when people would ask him what happened, he would tell them, my wife hit me with a cast iron skillet. And there was someone who actually believed him. We worked together at this place. It was the last job that he had, and I worked there for a while. And one of our coworkers came up to me and just stood there and glared at me at the desk. And he brought it up and I said, are you serious? You believe him? Do I need to bring in the medical record? He had surgery. I did not hit him with a cast iron skillet. And then as his dementia progressed, he was still telling the story, but he's telling it to random strangers. And I could not get him to stop doing it. I said, Lance, you've got to stop doing that. One of these days, somebody is going to believe that I hit you with a cast iron skillet. And he said, nobody's going to believe that. Who would do something like that? Nobody would hit anyone with a cast iron skillet. And I never got him to stop doing it.
I think I don't think I ever got to hear that story, but when you would tell me, he would laugh.
Yeah. That was another one of those things where he liked to poke fun at people. He liked to get a rise out of people. So I would still tell those stories, and I think that it did prompt his memory at times, and that was good. Some of the other things that we've talked about with dementia is not only that you're living in their world, but don't try to correct them. That was something that I had a really hard time with because I had a hard time lying to Lance. Lance and I talked about everything before the dementia. We shared everything with each other. And so it was really hard for me not to want to reason with him and to not correct him on those things because it wasn't just that I wanted my old Lance back and knowing that I would never get him back. That was just our relationship. We just talked about those things. So that was really hard. And one of the other things that I found very challenging when he would start getting agitated or upset about something, he would start, it was hard to get him out of a spiral when something was wrong in his world. And I had a hard time redirecting. So I did more distracting than anything. But if I couldn't get him to stop by just talking about something else, I would say, "Oh my gosh, Lance, I think I left my flat iron on in the bathroom. Hold on, I'll be right back." And I would take off and I'd be gone for a few seconds and I would come back into the room. And that was just enough. It was like a little switch flipped. And he didn't remember the conversation. And so I did that a lot in the beginning. Towards the end, I found it easier to redirect him. But in the beginning, I did more distracting than anything.
That sounds like a very good technique for someone who's exhausted. And that tendency, like you said, is naturally going to be to want to correct and no, this is how it actually happened. So I think when that starts to get exhausting, it's good to remember that there is that little reprieve from maybe resetting a switch, so to speak. That's that's good that you learned that because I'm sure that will be helpful to, people that are struggling with that downward spiral, like you said.
Yes. And when you're so burned out, which we've talked about many times, I was burned out for so many years. It's hard for your thought process to come up with something to redirect them. So for me, being able to run off into the other room because I forgot something. I mean, that was part of my personality anyway. I was like, oh my gosh, I think I might have forgotten to do this. So it wasn't anything unusual for me to do something like that. So it wasn't anything that made him suspicious or caught him off guard. It was just like, oh, she's done it again. So I know. Anyway, so those were just a few things. Like I said, there are so many great resources online for dementia and being able to talk to somebody too, having a counselor, that was really important for me because I couldn't talk to Lance about the things that were bothering me. I needed to talk to somebody. So having a counselor was very, very important, especially when he had dementia. I don't know what I would have done without my counselor. She was incredible. Well, thanks for joining me, Jenna. I will see you next time.
All right. We'll see you next time.